Hello students, this is Dr. Lyons, and this is our first video lecture for the semester. So this is going to be the very first chapter of the book, and the very first chapter goes into what biology is, it goes into what life is, and it goes into what the scientific method is a little bit. So let's begin. So the first part of the chapter gets into biology and what biology is. Right, so many of you maybe already know the answer to this questions, like what is biology and what do biologists do? Right, so biology, I think a lot of you know, is the study of life. So this prefix bio means life, and the suffix ology means the study of something. And so what biologists do is that they do scientific research, scientific studies on living things. So for instance, what you see in this picture here is me there with a couple of other colleagues. And what we're doing in this video is we were assessing the health of this coral reef in the Caribbean. Right, so that is something that a biologist might do, is go out and collect data out in the world, and then use that data to assess the health of that particular area. Of course, biology always doesn't always look this glamorous. I don't always wear a bright pink tank, although I do as often as I can. But a lot of biology is also, sitting at a desk and looking at the data that you've collected, or writing research papers, or writing grants, or doing lectures such as this one, doing classes. And there's a lot of biologists that don't ever actually really do research outdoors. Most of their stuff is done in labs as opposed to out in the field, like this picture shows. And like a lot of the research that I've done in the past has been more field-based research. So let's make this a little more specific when we say what biology is. Right? So biology is a scientific study of life. So then biologists are scientists that study life. And I wanted to make this distinction because there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of get an understanding of the living world around us. So for instance, one way that I like to learn a little bit about the world around me is through photography. So I like to take pictures of living things, of landscapes, both underwater and up on dry land. And that is a way that we can get to sort of appreciate and learn more about living things. This can be done through, of course, other media means. Through video and audio, you can document living things, and by doing so, come to learn about them a little bit more. But biology specifically refers to doing scientific work with life. So it's looking at life through the lens of science. So that then leads us to two questions. What is science and what is life? And that's the two questions that we are going to tackle through the rest of this chapter. So first we'll talk about what science is, and then we'll talk about what we mean when we say that something is living. So I first want you to think about, how you might define science and what might be some adjectives for science. This is one of my favorite cartoon scientists, so that's Professor Farnsworth from Futurama. And so he's, I guess you'd probably describe him as a physicist or something like that. So a lot of us would kind of think of adjectives that would apply to science as being adjectives such as like rigorous or methodical or systematic, adjectives that all kind of center around something being done in a very ordered, very particular way. And when we do scientific experiments, we do want to incorporate some of that. We do, you don't just, come up with a very flawed scientific study. You want to come up with a scientific study that, that actually tests what you're looking at and doesn't have some major flaws that means that you're not actually testing, what you're testing at all. And you're going to kind of learn about this when you do the lab, when you are going to devise an observation scheme for testing questions about the activity patterns of animals in your neighborhood. And how we might define science, something to do with a means of understanding the world around us in a sort of methodical, systematic way. Right, and so this is, pretty close to the definition that I just gave a minute ago. Right, so science is how we understand the natural world around us, and it's based on inquiry. Right, so that of course leads us to the question, what exactly is inquiry? And before I get into those two forms of science, let's go back to that question that I just posed a minute ago. So to inquire is to ask a question about something, right? When you're inquiring about something, you're asking a question. And so science is really built around questions, right? So you observe something, in the world around you, and you ask, why is it doing that? Or why is it behaving that way? And then you go about, coming up with answers to that question and testing to see whether those answers are correct, right? That is the kind of basis of how science works. And so there are two kind of flavors of science that I want to bring to your attention. There are, of course, many different there are many different fields of science, such as like genetics or physics or chemistry or marine biology. But what I'm getting at here is more kind of two different large approaches to science. So one kind of large approach is what the book defines as discovery science. So this is just merely describing nature around us. So we kind of look at things around us and we just kind of describe them. What does this look like? How does this particular thing behave? When is it that squirrels, are the most active in your neighborhood? Things like that. So that's discovery science. Whereas then hypothesis-driven science is going kind of beyond that, right? So rather than just merely describing how nature looks around us, it is getting more at explaining why nature is the way that it is. So it's getting at the underlying mechanisms that describe the world works. So for instance, if you were to, consider something like gravity. So say you're outside and you drop a rock and you notice that the rock falls towards the earth. So just the description of that would be more discovery science, like I let go of a rock and it falls towards the earth. We're describing how nature works. But then but then gravity and the theory of gravity then gets at more of an explanation of why that is. That there are these gravitational waves that link together different objects in the universe, and the more mass those objects have, the more of a gravitational field that they exert on other objects around them. That's getting at more explaining why it is that rock falls to the earth. I've got a couple more examples to kind of uh, uh, drive home the difference between discovery science and hypothesis-driven science. And so they are related to these two images that you see here. So this image on the top, this is of a kelp forest, right? So which are, fairly abundant off of our coastline here in Southern California, right? So these tall things, these are kelp. This orange thing here, that's a Garibaldi. That's the state fish of California. And these are obviously bones. Maybe some of you even know which bone this is. This is the femur. So that is the bone that connects the hip bone to the knee bone. Well, there's not really a knee bone. I guess there is a patella, but anyway, it's the bone that is in the upper part of your leg. Okay, so a discovery science type question that you might ask about a kelp forest is you might ask how many species are found in that kelp forest. And then you could go out and you could count, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, and all that. And then you would have just kind of described nature, just described how it is. Not really getting at why there are that number of species of things in that kelp forest, just how many there are. And with the femur, you could say, what is the femur length of different mammals, right? And then you could go out and you could get, a giraffe and I don't know, a cougar and a human and a cat, and you could measure the length of the femur of those different types of mammals. And that would just be describing nature, how long is the femur of different mammals. So, but then as I was saying before, hypothesis-driven science is more getting at why nature is the way it is. So it's getting more at explaining nature. So a question that you might ask related to kelp forests that gets at explaining a phenomenon is you could ask, is the number of species in a kelp, is it related to just how dense the kelp are? Meaning if you put more and more of this kelp in this area, is that going to increase the number of species that you have in that area? Right? And so then that is not really getting at just describing nature, that's getting at describing, why nature is the way it is. It's explaining why things occur. Something that we might ask about those femurs is we might ask, is the length of the femur of different mammals, is it related to how they walk? Is it related to whether they're bipedal or tetrapedal? Meaning, do they walk on 2 legs or do they walk on 4 legs? And you could maybe make some statement about, or maybe you might find that perhaps things that walk on 2 legs tend to have proportionally longer femurs, or maybe things that walk on 2 legs tend to have shorter femurs. This is getting at describing why nature is the way it is, not just describing how it is. So think of the best kind of way to remember this is think of hypothesis-driven questions as kind of why type questions. Why are there so many species in this kelp forest? And is the number of species in that kelp forest, is that related to the density? Or why are the lengths of different femurs of different mammals different? Is it related to, say, how they walk? So that's getting at why questions, explaining why nature is the way it is. Whereas discovery questions are more like how or what questions. So just simply describing nature. Okay, so a very, very important part of nature, and really important of science, more I should say, is what you see kind of emblemized in these 2 pictures. So this is data. So this is a character data, and this is of course data going into your phone. So data, we now know it's a character and it's what our phones use. But it's a very important thing in the context of science, and we kind of use it differently from how we would describe data going into our cell phone plans. So data are essentially observations that we record when we are out in nature, or when we are doing an experiment in a lab. It's basically information that science is based on. So in science, in all the various fields of science, and in the 2 flavors of science, the sort of discovery science and hypothesis-driven science, data is crucial because scientists, you can't just say whatever you want if you're a scientist. You have to back it up with some evidence to provide support for your claims. Right, so scientists can't just say, this is why the world is the way it is. This is why rocks fall to the planet. No, you actually have to have some data to back yourself up. So data is kind of like the currency of science. In order to have scientific credibility, in order for your claims to have credibility, you have to have data to back them up. And so there's a lot of different, ways that scientists can collect data. This is showing just 3 of many different types of data that I've collected. So what you see here is a very, very young version of myself, probably about the age of many of you watching this video now. And what I'm doing is I'm on a beach in Massachusetts on the east coast of the US where I grew up. And I was doing some research on the algae on that beach, right? So all this kind of brownish and green stuff is algae. And what I'm doing there is I'm using this tool right here called a quadrat to estimate just how much of the beach is covered with different types of algae, right? So that's one type of data collection. What I'm doing here with my colleagues, with our awesome pink scuba tanks, is estimating the percent cover of different types of corals on the seafloor, right? So how much of the seafloor is covered by coral A, and how much of the seafloor is covered by coral B and coral C and D, and so on and so forth, right? So that's some data collection. And what I'm doing here is I'm looking at very small fishes, right? So maybe like look at the length of your pinky. So fish is about that big. And what I've done a lot of research on is on the behavior of such small fishes. So this is essentially me in my Zen place, just sitting on the seafloor, being completely motionless and just watching fishes and recording what they do. So like recording, what they eat, how often they eat, if they have aggressive interactions with other fish, if they have interactions with other types of species, crabs and shrimps and things like that. So just looking at various aspects of their behavior. So what you see with these three different, bits of data collection is that they're all pertaining to things that we can observe very easily, right? So you can observe algae and you can observe corals and you can observe what fish do, right? So science is limited to things that we can observe, either with our own eyes or through some instruments. Of course, there's a whole field of biology that is focused on things that we can't see with our eyes, right? So this is microbiology. But of course, you can use a tool, a microscope, in order to study, those microscopic organisms. There's another field of biology that does something similar, right? So the field of genetics, is looking at DNA. You obviously can't see DNA with your own naked eye, but with different types of instruments, you can essentially observe how DNA behaves. So science is limited to things that we can observe and things that we can measure directly or indirectly, right? So it's very easy to get an estimate of how much of this beach is covered with these different types of algae, or how much of the seafloor is covered by coral, or how many times a small fish, goes and eats a crab. Those are very easy things to measure directly. So we can only really do science on things that we can observe and things that we can measure, right? Things outside of that, things like, I don't know, ghosts, those are things that we can't really do, science on. Even if there are, some fairly ridiculous, TV shows with people chasing down ghosts and pretending to be very scientific as they're going about it, you can't really do science on ghosts because you can't really, you know, really observe them or measure them. Okay, so now we're going to focus in a little bit more on the hypothesis-driven science, and we're going to go a little bit more into the scientific method. And you're going to learn about this even more when you're doing the first lab of the semester. And so probably a lot of you have already learned about these maybe in a high school chemistry or physics or biology class. And so probably a lot of you already know what the steps of the scientific method are, right? So it includes things like observations and questions and hypotheses and predictions. So let's talk a little bit about how those things fit into each other. And how we're going to talk about them is with a real world example, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about this fish right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on this fish. And then what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video and I want you to then in Canvas, I want you to click on the Lionfish video link. And that's going to bring up a video that's going to kind of show the steps of the scientific method using lionfish and using an experiment that me and a friend of mine did some years ago. Okay, so first some background on lionfish, right? So they are these really beautiful fish, and where you can find them is in the Indo-Pacific, so places like Indonesia, Australia, places like that. But you can also now find them in the Atlantic Ocean, in places like the Bahamas and Puerto Rico and Haiti and places like that. So they belong in the former, so they belong in places like Indonesia. They don't belong in places like the Bahamas. In this picture that I took here, this was in Bonaire, which is an island just north of Venezuela in the Atlantic Ocean. They don't belong in that area. So that's the first thing you should know about them, is that they are invasive species. Another thing that you should know about them is that they are very, very prolific and very harmful invasive species. And why that is kind of two reasons. So one reason is that they're covered in venomous spines. So these spines on the top of them there have venom in them. and it's a very, very painful venom. I've personally never been poked by one. Every time I've done, research on them, I've been very careful and made sure that that didn't happen. But anybody that I know that has been poked by one of these has wanted to cut their hand off because it was so painful. So you can imagine if you were a shark and you came along and ate one of these things, you probably wouldn't eat another one. So that is one thing that is kind of protecting this invasive species. Another reason why they might be so good at being invasive is that they're very prolific hunters. So they're very, very good at eating things. And so what you're going to do now is I want you to take a look at that video. And I want you to first, there's is kind of a series of different videos, some from nature and some from a scientific experiment that me and a friend of mine did. So in the first couple of videos, you're going to make some observations. So take a look at what that lionfish was doing in that video. And then I want you to, kind of see or kind of think about what question you have about what that lionfish is doing. There's one really weird thing that the lionfish is doing in the video. I'll give you a hint. Kind of look at its face. That is going to be where there's something kind of strange going on. And then in the latter part of the video, then you're going to see how we kind of tested what was going on there. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've all now watched that video of the lionfish, and so now you have all seen this image here, where at the very end of the video, I very carefully put some dye in front of the mouth of the lionfish, and you all saw the dye shoot towards this smaller fish at the bottom of the frame. So let's work through the steps of this scientific experiment that me and my friend Mark did. Right, so we started with the observation. And maybe you had the same observation yourself when you were watching the video. So when lionfish are about to strike at a prey that they want to eat, you can see them rapidly flaring their gills. So their gills are kind of going in and out and in and out. So their mouth is kind of, their whole mouth cavity is expanding and shrinking and expanding and shrinking. So the obvious question is, why do they do that? What exactly is going on there? And so we hypothesized that they are blowing jets of water at the prey. So we hypothesized, no, maybe they're squirting water at the prey. Kind of in the same way that if you were, I don't know, eating some very hot soup, you might blow at that hot soup in order to cool it down. Not that lionfish might be cooling down their prey, but they are blowing water at it for some reason. So then this led to our prediction. And there's an important point here to be made in that hypotheses and predictions are oftentimes very hard to tell apart. And the reason for that is that not all scientific experiments include they all include a hypothesis. They don't always include a prediction. So a prediction is included if you can't test the hypothesis directly. Because there are some hypotheses that you just can't, test directly. And this happens to be one of these. Because it's very hard to test, directly if lionfish blow jets of water at their prey, because you can't actually see water moving. So we came up with a prediction related to that if we put dye between the mouth of the lionfish and the prey, that the dye would move towards the prey. And so this prediction follows logically from the hypothesis. And so if the prediction is found to be true, then that would provide support for the hypothesis. So a prediction is always going to be something that follows logically from the hypothesis. They're going to be very related to each other. The distinction between them is that the prediction is what you directly test with an experiment. Whereas with a hypothesis, sometimes you can test it directly, but sometimes you can't. So then we did an experiment. We found that our experiment supported our hypothesis because it showed that the prediction was true. And so then what often happens is more predictions you come up with newer predictions to keep testing the same thing. Because the more times you test the hypothesis, the closer it comes to being considered scientific fact. And we'll get to a little bit more about what that means in a minute. And one last thing about what's going on here. probably a lot of you are now wondering, okay, so they blow jets of water at their prey, so why? Why exactly would that be useful? And me and my wife, we did some follow-up experiments on this, and what we found is that it seems to confuse the small fish. It seems to, and what it seems to do specifically is it increases the reaction time of the small fish. So imagine if you were running a race, say you're running a 100-meter sprint, and you're there at the starting blocks, and say the gun goes off, and you wait a couple of seconds, and then you start sprinting. Obviously you're going to lose the race because you reacted way too slowly. And that's kind of what happens here. When jets of water get blown at a small fish, it lowers its reaction speed. So it doesn't react to this lionfish lunging at it as quickly. So essentially the lionfish is able to get much closer to the small fish before the fish reacts in a way that would allow it to escape. So it's kind of confusing and slowing down the small fish is what it seems to be doing. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about in terms of science is theories in science. So you kind of are probably used to hearing theories and hypotheses, those two terms being used interchangeably. Because in common, speech, just when we're like talking with friends and family, we typically use the word theory, even though what we actually really mean from a scientific perspective is a hypothesis. Right, so a hypothesis is an explanation to an observation that we see in nature, whereas a theory then is essentially a hypothesis that has been tested many times over and over again. And a theory is kind of a hypothesis that is essentially considered to be scientific fact, right? So like gravity, that's a theory, right? So we know that gravity's been tested so many times that we know that it is a thing. Or like Darwin's theory of evolution by the means of natural selection, right? That is a theory, right? That hypothesis has been tested so many times that now we consider it to be a theory. So theories and hypotheses, very different things. So if you hear, or if you have ever yourself said something like, I theorize that, what you actually more mean is hypothesize that, because a hypothesis and a theory are two very different things. So theories, one other thing I want to bring up is that they tend to be kind of broader in scope than hypotheses. What I mean by that is they kind of encompass more. So consider, for instance, Darwin's theory of evolution. That's pretty broad because that applies to every single living thing on this entire planet, right? It doesn't get much broader than applying to every living thing that is around us. Whereas my hypothesis that lionfish blow jets of water at their prey, that's a lot more specific. It applies to one type of fish doing one particular behavior to achieve one particular purpose, getting food. So the lionfish water jet thing, that's really more of a hypothesis because it's a lot more narrow in scope. Also, we've only tested it a couple of times. Whereas Darwin's theory of natural selection, it's definitely a theory because it's been, tested many times, and it's incredibly broad in scope. So theories, like I was saying, they're supported by a much greater abundance of evidence. In theories, they tend to then promote other ideas that come from them. So Darwin, published his ideas about evolution and natural selection in 1859, so over 150 years ago. And since then, of course, there's been many other hypotheses that have come about since then, because he kind of laid the groundwork, and then there's been a lot of work since then to figure out the more specifics of how those things work. So theories also tend to promote spin-off theories or hypotheses. Okay, so then the second part of this chapter that I want to get into is life, and what distinguishes the living things from the non-living things, right? Because when we move about in the world, we can kind of look at a lot of things and just intuitively know whether or not they are alive or not. Uh, but most of us don't really know, what exactly is it that we are, what are the criteria that we're using subconsciously to determine whether or not something is a living thing or a non-living thing. And so that's kind of what we're going to cover here. We're going to go through the criteria that distinguishes life from non-life. Right? So for instance, we're going to talk about what are the things that this thing over here, this fish, so this is what's known as a grouper, right? So what distinguishes this grouper from this thing over here, which is a 1990 Suzuki Samurai that I affectionately named Drempel, which is the Dutch word for a speed bump, because this car was a total wreck. Even just driving on flat ground, you felt like you were driving over speed bumps. And my wife and I owned this car when we lived on a Dutch island, which is why we named it Drempel. Anyway, this is clearly a non-living thing, and this is a living thing. So let's talk about how we distinguish between these two different things and how we tell that one is living and one isn't living. So we'll talk about 7 properties or criteria. And in order for you to be a living thing, you have to have all 7 of those. So there are, in fact, non-living things that might have one or more of those properties, but to be considered living, you got to have all of them. So the first criteria I wanted to talk about is order, right? So living things have a particular arrangement, a particular sequence or pattern or method that makes them up, right? So for instance, what you see here, this is a type of worm. This is what's known as a Christmas tree worm. In the part that you're looking at are its gills, which it uses for feeding and for breathing. And you can see that there's a particular arrangement of those gills, right? There's all these frilly things coming off of them. They're kind of wound in this kind of corkscrew pattern. There's a particular arrangement of them. Of course, there are non-living things that have this as well, right? So this is a type of diamond, of course. In diamonds, they have a particular arrangement in a particular build to them. But diamonds don't have the other properties of life that this Christmas tree worm does. So order is an important part of life. Regulation is another important part of life. So regulation is essentially maintaining internal conditions that are different from the world around us. So for instance, inside of us, it's really warm and it's really wet, right? So our internal temperatures are something like 98 degrees, and we are 70% weight by water approximately. So I'm assuming that the environment that you are in right now while you are watching this video lecture is probably different from that, right? I assume that none of you are in a swimming pool while you are watching this video lecture. And unless your air conditioner is broken, I'm assuming that it's not 98 degrees in the room that you are watching this in, right? So our internal conditions are different from the conditions outside of us, right? So all living things maintain specific internal conditions separate from the world around us. And you can kind of see this in this picture. This is I don't know, a cute little dog, I guess. And this is a heat map. It's showing you that this dog is much warmer than the environment around it. Okay, growth and development is another really important criteria of life, right? So this means getting bigger and changing as you get bigger, right? So this is, the stages of a little baby chick on its way to becoming, a marshmallow peep. No, in case you're wondering, this is not how peeps are actually made. But we can see that as this chick is growing inside the egg, it's getting bigger, and of course, its shape is changing. And of course, the same thing happens with us. You're much bigger than you are when you were born, and also your shape is much different from when you were born. Right? When we're infants, we tend to have much, relatively big heads, relatively short limbs, relatively short torso. Whereas when we're adults, we have relatively smaller heads and longer limbs in the torso, right? So we grow and we develop. And there are things that are non-living that grow and develop. Snowflakes are a good example of this, right? So snowflakes get bigger and they change over time as they are, up in the atmosphere, falling towards Earth. But snowflakes don't have the other criteria of life that that living things have. Okay, another really important aspect of life is processing energy from the environment, right? So everything that we do requires energy. And energy is essentially just the capacity to change things. You can almost think of it as like the capacity to do work, right? So taking notes right now, that requires energy. In your heart beating, that requires energy. In sitting, where you are right now, that requires energy. There's muscles that are keeping you from falling on the floor, right? All of those things require energy to do. And where we get that energy from is the environment around us, so the external world around us, right? So we eat things, we go to In-N-Out Burger and we eat Pop-Tarts and cereal or whatever it is that you eat, whatever your preferred food is. What you're essentially doing is taking the energy that is in that food and you're using that energy then to do all the things that you do. Take notes and listen attentively to these riveting video lectures and things like that. Or if you're, say, a great white shark, you might eat sea lions and then use that energy stored inside that sea lion to, go make more baby sharks and go terrorize surfers or whatever it is that you like to do if you're a great white shark. So all living things process energy from the world around them. Okay, all living things respond to the environment around them, because there are things around us that we want to avoid and things around us that we want to go towards. Right? So some of the responses that we have to the environment include, things like that's food. You might be driving on the highway and I don't know, you're getting a little tired and hangry and you see an In-N-Out Burger sign and you say that's food. Or you might see a predator and say, that's something I want to avoid. Or maybe you're at the club and you say, ooh, that could be a potential mate over there. Right? So these are all ways that we respond to the environment. Why I have this picture here is this is a rainbow trout, and it saw this and it responded by saying that's food. And I responded by saying, ooh, this is food. More specifically, this is going to become a fish taco. Another really important criteria of life is that living things can make more living things, right? So there's more making whole living things like making babies, but then inside of us, there are cells making more cells, right? So the cells that you have in your body, for the most part, none of them were there when you were born. And so what has happened is that cells inside your body make more cells, right? That's how we function essentially, because our cells get worn out over time and they have to reproduce. They have to make more cells to replace themselves. And we produce, whole living things, right? If we so choose, we can make babies, and all living things can make offspring, can make more living things. And that's what you see going on here. So these are what are known as Nassau groupers, and they are spawning. Their sex is very different from ours. They essentially just swim up into the water and they just squirt, their stuff, their sperm and their eggs just out in the water column. It's over in about half a second. Very different sex from us. I assume none of you have sex in this way. If you do, no judgment. But this is how these animals reproduce. Finally, one really important aspect of life is that it evolves, right? So life changes over time. If you were to build a time machine and go back in time, say 300 million years, the life that you would find on the planet would be very different. So for instance, there wouldn't be any birds and there wouldn't be any mammals, right? So the living things that you would encounter would be very different from the living things that you see right now. And that's kind of amplified by, this sticker that maybe you've seen before. This is a little period of time known as the squid time, when Neanderthals turned into squid, and then we turned back into a human-like thing. Obviously, I kid, this is fake. Well, not the evolution part of it, but the squid part of it is fake. Our ancestors are not squid. Okay, so that's all I've got to tell you about the scientific method and about life. So in the next video lecture, we will talk a little bit more about the molecules that make up us.